Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
So I heard my door opening in my sleep because it made that really loud creak sound. And my dogs heard at the same time. So simultaneously, all three of us popped up. My dogs, as soon as they heard this, they went into full feral mode, foaming at the mouth, barking, growling, jumping off the bed. I'm pretty sure one of them came close to breaking my...
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and moral corruption. We have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. Coming to you, freshly recorded from San Diego, California, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Hey there, it's Super Bowl Sunday, and Kinda Murdery is just crazy enough to drop a brand spanking new episode at 5 p.m. Pacific time, which means the game is probably somewhere in the second quarter, so if you're not a football fan, go ahead and listen to Kinda Murdery instead. I actually am a football fan. Go Niners. Sucked when the Eagles beat us. I'm probably watching the game right now. But if you are listening to Kinda Murdery when you could be watching the Super Bowl, that snippet of a phone call that you heard right after the content warning was of course a piece of the call from Taylor from Durham, North Carolina, telling the story of the time that she and her two Great Danes foiled a potential break-in, and her story inspired me to tell the story of the mauling of Malissa Matthews, a woman who was killed instead of protected by her two Great Danes. That said, I want to be clear, and I say this both for Taylor, who I appreciate for listening and calling, but also to be fair to Great Danes. They are a very sweet dog breed. The story I'm telling doesn't represent Great Danes writ large at all. Prior to the death of Malissa Matthews in 2019, Great Danes as a breed had been responsible for the deaths of only 3 people in the US and Canada in nearly 40 years. By contrast, some of the more notorious breeds have killed literally hundreds in the same time span. Okay, so that's my Great Danes really are sweet dogs, don't misunderstand me disclaimer. Let's get to the story. You have arrived at part 2 of Scooby-Doo, Why Did You? The Mysterious Mauling of Malissa Matthews. That's right, I said part 2, so if you haven't heard part 1 yet, go back and listen to it. Then, rejoin us. I'll save you a seat. Alright, as I often do, I'll rewind the story just slightly to allow you to settle back into the narrative. Please do join me as we unravel motive and mystery. Part 2 of Scooby-Doo, Why Did You? The Mysterious Mauling of Malissa Matthews starts now. Mary Matthews received the Great Dane named Bo Jackson from Renoshek's Save Rocky the Great Dane Rescue on January 5, 2019. Renoshek subsequently shared more than 30 pages of documentation that Matthews submitted to Save Rocky the Great Dane Rescue and Rehab before they released Bo Jackson to her. Mary Matthews also transmitted to Renoshek many photos and video images of Bo Jackson settling into the Matthews home. The photos showed several different parts of the house, with little sign anywhere of the neglect described in the Waynesville police report of Mary Matthews' death scene. The only visible beer cans in any of the photos and video images were on a lampside table beside Mark Dale Matthews, and tipped over beside his foot in a videotaped roughhousing scene. And despite Mark Dale's assertion that his wife would pop pills in the morning and then drink beer all day until she passed out, ultimately, the coroner's toxicology report would find neither alcohol nor any illegal drugs in Mary Matthews' system, and so the plot thickens. About the only thing we know for sure is that Mark Dale Matthews seems to have a loose association with the truth. It's time now for the story of Caitlin and Colt. We've just learned how the Matthews acquired Bo Jackson from the Great Dane Rescue in Texas. Bo, who was one of the 2 Great Danes impounded from Mary Matthews' death scene. Caitlin, the third black Great Dane to live in the Matthews home since 2017, was not present at the scene. Caitlin had been adopted from Indiana resident Laura Grimer on February 6, 2019, after biting 2 adults and 3 middle schoolers in her previous household. The bite history would have made Caitlin a suspect in Mary Matthews' death had Caitlin been there. However, Caitlin was reclaimed by Grimer less than 3 weeks after her arrival. Grimer alleged that Caitlin suffered from having been kept outdoors and underfed during her time in the Matthews home. Colt, a male black Great Dane, appeared in photos that Mary Matthews posted to social media in April 2019 and on September 25, 2019. Colt was the other Great Dane impounded after Mary Matthews' death. Some circumstantial evidence suggests that Colt might have been adopted from Harlequin Haven Great Dane Rescue in Bethel Brown County, Ohio, just over an hour south of Waynesville on the I-275. Harlequin Haven founder Dave Bath, however, did not mention having had anything to do with either Matthews in a discussion with Springfield News-Sun reporter Lawrence Budd after the fatal attack. So now we know about Bo Jackson and Colt. But who was the third dog? Adding yet another layer of tragedy to Mary Matthews' death is the fact that both Bo Jackson and Colt were put down on November 2, 2019. Their heads were preserved for rabies testing and perhaps for forensic odontology to see if their teeth match wounds on Mary Matthews' body. But, according to the article by Merritt Clifton, neither Colt nor Bo Jackson were necessarily involved in killing Mary Matthews. The presence of an unidentified third dog may be inferred by the presence of the apparent third food bowl shown among the crime scene photos. The 3 a.m. outburst of barking the neighbor heard 2 days after Mary Matthews was last known to have been alive might hypothetically have coincided with her death, or, in the view of the state of her remains hinting at an earlier death, with the unknown third dog either escaping or being removed from the scene. Or perhaps the dogs went wild at 3 a.m. that night because a killer returned to the scene to examine his crime. What exactly am I talking about? Well, let's start with the state of Mary Matthews' remains, implying that she died sometime earlier than the Halloween night that law enforcement has presumed. Officer Blaha noted in her report that Mary Matthews' remains were very much dead and bloated. Despite this, if you'll recall, her stepson took CPR instructions from the dispatcher when he called in her death, which would imply that he believed her to have died recently, something that, according to Blaha's description, is virtually impossible, although Mary's stepson may not have been aware of this. You see, all along, law enforcement proceeded on the assumption that Mary had died on the 31st and was discovered on November 1st. But it generally takes 3 or 4 days for a body to bloat. It is possible for a body to bloat within 12 hours, which would have to be the assumption for the condition of Mary's corpse to make any sense based on when law enforcement presumed she died. It is possible for a body to bloat within 12 hours, but in order for that to happen, the body would have to be kept in very hot conditions. Markdale Matthews checked into jail at 10:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2019, turning himself in for failure to pay child support, but a car rented to Mary Matthews returned home, presumably after dropping off Markdale, and was never seen to move again. This was on October 30th, 2019. Also on that same day, Mary Matthews' employer received a text, presumably from Mary Matthews, although we all know that somebody else can easily get their hand on a cell phone, and even unlock it, especially with facial recognition. I don't know if iPhones or Android phones can tell if a person is alive or not, but I imagine that just the actual face would unlock the phone. So the text message certainly doesn't convince me that Mary Matthews was still alive. The neighbor's camera didn't pick up any motion in or out of the Matthews home after noon on October 30th, 2019. So law enforcement's assumption generally has been that Mary Matthews must have died from dog attack one of 3 times. Sometime after noon on October 30th, sometime on October 31st, or at 3 a.m. on November 1st, 2019, the time at which the neighbor reported the dogs at the Matthews house going wild. All 3 of these windows exonerate Mark Dale Matthews, who was in jail during that time. On October 30th, the daily high temperature was 57 degrees and the low was 51. The 31st had a high of 59 and a low of 34. As for November 1st, it was cold. Between midnight and 6 a.m., Waynesville showed a high of 37 and a low of 28. based on the speed a body bloats, absent high temperatures, it is unlikely that Mary was killed on the 30th or the 31st, and it is borderline impossible that she was killed when the dogs went wild at 3 a.m. on November 1st, only to be discovered by her husband hours later. The high for that entire day of November 1st, by the way, was 46 degrees. There was no time for Mary's body to have achieved a bloat. Brandon Evans and his sister Brooke Francis, Mary Matthews' children by her previous marriage to Florida heavy equipment repair technician Michael Evans, said they, quote, cannot comprehend how their mother would have been mauled to death by her Great Danes inside her home, reported Karen Johnson of WLWT5 Television News. According to Facebook posts shared by Mary Matthews' children, she referred to her dogs as her, quote, lazy Danes. In September 2019, she posted photos of them on social media, curled up on her couch. From everything I'm seeing, I have questions, Brandon Evans told Johnson. She was our mother, and she was a person. This deserves to be investigated. He became even more emphatic. This has been brushed aside. With the help of Clear Creek and Warren County, it's been brushed aside, and she's just been chalked up as another druggie who was too incoherent to call them for help. They said she was a pain in their side. They didn't like her, Evans continued, and his sister, Brooke Francis, agreed. The Waynesville police appeared to conclude their investigation that day, based partly on Mark Dale Matthews' claim that reported Mary Matthews was unable to defend herself from the dogs. She's not as weak as they say she is, her son Brandon insisted. Michael Evans, Mary's first husband, agreed, saying that Mary Matthews had formerly been an expert rider used to handling horses much larger and stronger than her Great Danes. He also described several discrepancies in Mary Matthews' purported behavior after she was attacked. For example, Michael Evans said she would have immediately called for an ambulance if only to use the injuries as a pretext for getting more prescription pain pills. No one disputed that Mary Matthews had an issue with pain medication. Both Michael and Brandon Evans acknowledged that she abused prescription drugs, but disputed that she was a heavy beer drinker. That, they both said, was more like Mark Dale Matthews' behavior. In the immediate aftermath of Mary Matthews' death, Coroner Doyle Burke told Matthews' survivors that the direction of further police investigation would likely be guided by a forensic toxicology report, and that the toxicology tests would take several weeks to complete. He acknowledged that further investigations, such as microscopic examination of Matthews' multiple wounds, could provide new evidence, but finished, saying, "We are open to any information. Some things just can't be proven." The animal welfare organization Animals 24/7, as part of writing the article that I've referenced in this episode, spent over a week looking for clues about the possible identity of the third dog, but could uncover nothing. Just that photo of 3 dirty dog bowls in a row, as if 3 dogs had been fed together shortly before Mary Matthews died. A red folder labeled Investigation of the Death of Mary Matthews contains quite a bit of information, including text messages, call logs, photos, police reports, and a coroner's report. It's not an official investigative file, but one created by Matthews' daughter, Brooke Francis. When I heard she was attacked by dogs, I felt very confused. I had so many questions, Brooke said. Police said the dogs were found on the back patio, but it didn't make any sense to me how Mom was able to open the door and put them out before collapsing, but yet she didn't call anyone for help. Now that the coroner's report has been released, Brooke Francis has even more questions. The coroner basically said that we needed to know that she had no alcohol in her system and that there was only therapeutic levels of her medication. She was taking her prescribed medication as she was supposed to. You see, one theory is that Mary Matthews was so intoxicated and not in a right state of mind that she was unable to fight off a dog attack or call 911. The toxicology report showing lack of alcohol, illegal drugs, or illegal levels of prescription drugs seem to make that theory a virtual impossibility. However, the toxicology results did not change the coroner's ruling that Mary Matthews' death was accidental. Doyle Burke, chief investigator for the Warren County coroner, said it's likely Mary Matthews slowly bled to death, and as she bled out, she lost mental acuity. The coroner pointed out that every injury on her body was consistent with dog bites from a Great Dane. I did see her body, and I did see the bites, and I do believe that she was attacked by dogs and died from loss of blood, her daughter Brooke Francis said. She's not questioning the cause of her mother's death, but rather the circumstances surrounding it and the investigation itself. She said that's why she began her own investigation. There's so many weird coincidences surrounding her death that it just doesn't make sense. For instance, the car Mary Matthews shared with her husband had mysteriously burned in their driveway 1 week before her death. What? Okay. Brooke Francis insists that she's not just a grieving daughter looking for someone to blame. I'm just tired of hearing that, she says, because this isn't an emotional response. I have solid evidence of stuff, and I have information to prove that there's more to this story. We just want to feel like our concerns are being heard and that there's been a thorough look into this. That's all that we're asking for, said Brooke's husband, Tom. Yes, and I believe there's a possibility that there is someone who had something to do with this and wanted her gone, said Francis, who has collected phone records, text message chains, and legal documents that she says are enough to prompt a fresh look at her mother's death. Chief of Police Terrell said he and his investigators had met with Matthews' children and reviewed evidence turned over to them. The police chief, a former major crimes detective in Middletown, said a Florida-based investigator had, quote, fanned the flames, unquote, for Francis and brother Brandon Evans with a third dog theory, possibly involving a coyote or another dog they had at the house that, quote, just doesn't hold up for us, unquote. She was bitten over 200 times, the police chief said, suggesting the loss of blood could have compromised her ability to save herself with a call for help. This took a matter of time, said Doyle Burke, the coroner. She could have called for help. She chose not to. As I've already mentioned, both Coroner Burke and Police Chief Terrell acknowledged that the toxicology test showed no trace of alcohol and only the level of drugs associated with Matthews' prescription, as well as no illicit drugs, which adds to the questions as to why Mary Matthews never called 911, although she took time to change her clothes after the attack. The lack of alcohol also, as previously alluded to, seems to contradict her husband's assertion that she abused drugs and beer every day. Those statements came through him, not through us, said Police Chief Terrell, while noting that beer cans were stacked 2 foot thick around the house. When asked about the implication of the lack of alcohol, illicit drugs, or overuse of illegal drugs in Mary Matthews' system, the coroner would only say, "We're working hand in hand with the Clear Creek police. There's not a whole lot more to say about it." As for the police chief, he seemed to tire of anyone who thought there was more to the case than what appeared on the surface. "We need to wrap this up," Terrell said. "We need to make sure there's nothing else out there." Shouldn't making sure there's nothing else out there come before wrapping it up? And of course, Mary Matthews' children have very different feelings about the case than the authorities. "I believe that there's a possibility that there is someone who had something to do with this and wanted her gone," Mary's daughter Brooke said. Brooke's brother Brandon said just after his mother's death that he believed that Mary was a problem for the local police and the subject of a protection order neighbors had obtained from the court. "Well, they say she was a pain in their side," Evans said. "They didn't like her." Brandon Evans said police appeared to conclude their investigation that day, based partly on Mark Dale Matthews' statements that she was unable to defend herself from the dogs. But neither of Mary Matthews' children accept the law enforcement version of what has happened. Says Brooke, "I felt and we felt that there wasn't enough investigating done to prove that these dogs actually did it, and that there wasn't something else or someone else that could have contributed to this or to get those dogs to attack her." Brooke declined to share her theories because she doesn't want to implicate anyone who hasn't been formally charged. "I wouldn't share theories unless I had solid evidence," Brooke Francis said. "But yes, I have other theories about this, and I have evidence to prove it." All right, let's step back for a moment and try to connect some of the dots of what it seems is allegedly being implied here, both by Mary Melissa Matthews' daughter and son, and also by some facts of the case that don't quite seem to add up to the apparent law enforcement conclusion that this was purely a tragic mauling of an inebriated woman by her 2 pet Great Danes, a breed which, once again, in almost 40 years, has killed only 3 people in the U.S. and Canada. Okay, let's take a look at some of the facts of the case and talk about which things seem just a little hard to swallow. Here are the facts as we know them and as they are assumed. On the morning of Wednesday, October 30th, 2019, the Matthews neighbor reported that a person who was apparently Mary Matthews drove Mark Dale Matthews from the Matthews home to jail, where Mark Dale checked in at 10:30 a.m. Although Mark and Mary owned a car that they shared, Mark was driven to jail in a rental car. Mark went to jail to turn himself in to serve a 3-day sentence for failure to pay child support. Now, why was Mary driving a rental car? Well, as we know, because 1 week earlier, the car that the estranged couple shared mysteriously burned After apparently dropping Mark off, Mary allegedly returned home in the rental car around noon, enters the house, and is not seen alive again, nor is anyone seen entering or exiting the Matthews home after that point, at noon, on October 30th. But at some point on October 30th, Mary or someone with access to her phone texts Mary's boss. This may be the last time that Mary was heard from alive. Then, at 3 a.m. on the morning of November 1st, the neighbors hear Mary's dogs go wild. Later that same morning, Mark Dale Matthews is released from jail. He tells police that he tried to call Mary, but she didn't answer. So he called his son Luke to come pick him up, which Luke did. They return to the Matthews home around 2:30 p.m., where Mark finds Mary's body and Luke makes the 911 call on Mark's behalf. Mary's body has obviously been mauled by dogs. There's blood everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, on the body, on the washer, on the dryer. Later, Officer Blaha would describe Mary's corpse as, quote, bloated and obviously dead. And yet, when Luke made the 911 call, he told the dispatcher he thought Mary had OD'd and received a full regimen of CPR instructions without mentioning the condition of the body or the fact that blood spatter was everywhere. When Mary's body was found in the house, there were large pyramids of empty beer cans stacked around the house. Mark made a point of telling investigators that Mary's daily routine consisted of popping pills and drinking beer all day until she passed out. Those who knew them said Mark was the beer drinker, not Mary. When Mary's body was found, 2 Great Danes were outside on the porch. But there were 3 dog food bowls and only 2 dogs. Mark goes to great pains to insist that the Great Danes were vicious, despite the breed's track record of having only killed 3 people in the US and Canada in the past 40 years prior to Mary. Mary herself had a history of breeding pit bulls, a breed that's killed almost 500 people in those same last 40 years. Now, I won't go into depth about the case here, as it would sidetrack us, and when I say the case, I'm talking about the case of the murder of Angela Kaplan by Jeffrey Mann via his pit bull, Mac. But back in 1992, the post-argument Mauling murder of Angela Kaplan was the first ever murder conviction in the United States where a living animal was used as a murder weapon, that animal being Mac the pit bull. Mann was convicted in 93 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. So suffice to say that apparent, tragic dog maulings have been more than just maulings in the past, at least with breeds other than Great Danes. Essentially, the official theory of the case, which has since been closed as a tragic mauling, goes something like this. Mary was in the midst of her daily regimen, as alleged by Mark Dale, of popping pills and chugging can after can of beer until she lost consciousness. She's in the midst of that routine. I suppose she hasn't lost consciousness yet, when for some reason she's mauled by her Great Danes. Then, because of how intoxicated she is, she doesn't realize the extent of her injuries, but she's still not too injured to manage to force the 2 human-sized vicious animals that were so furious, despite this description not matching the temperament of the breed, but they were so furious, so feral, that they brutally mauled Mary to death and bit chunks out of her body. And so, despite that level of fury in 2 human-sized dogs, remember how our caller, Taylor from North Carolina, said that her own 2 Great Danes nearly accidentally broke her ribs when they were angry, and that was in an attempt to protect her. That's how strong and large these dogs are. But nevertheless, allegedly too intoxicated to call for help, Mary is able to subdue these furious, huge, feral, mauling dogs and get them back outside. And then, because she was so intoxicated she didn't realize she'd been mortally wounded, she decided to change her clothes, and at some point succumbed to her injuries and died. That's the official version of what happened, and also that all of it likely occurred in the early morning of November 1st when the neighbor heard the dogs go nuts at 3 a.m. There was no third dog, and Mary allegedly tragically died approximately 11 to 15 hours before she was first observed by Officer Blaha, who described her body as obviously dead and bloated. Now, I think most of you listening to all of that will feel how I feel, that something seems off, something doesn't seem to pass the smell test. So let's move forward and see if we can clarify stuff at all, make it sound more likely at all. And let's start with a couple of assumptions. Now, this is not an assumption. Mary and Mark Matthews were estranged. But let's start with the assumption that not everything Mark Dale Matthews says is necessarily true. Now, that's not really an assumption either, as we know, for example, that his stated means of the way in which the Great Danes were acquired from an unknown couple for $25 and over his objections was not at all how the Great Danes were acquired, and there's plenty of documentation to prove that that statement, at least, was false. So we're not making assumptions, actually, when we say that Mark Dale Matthews doesn't always tell the truth. Here's our next assumption. Temperamentally, Great Danes are statistically unlikely, in fact so improbable as to be almost to the point of statistical impossibility. That's how unlikely Great Danes are to maul someone to death. Remember, Mark said the Danes were vicious, and Mark said the beer cans were Mary's. Instead, let's just flip just those two things around. Let's say the beer cans were Mark's. After all, no alcohol, illicit drugs, or even high levels of her prescription drugs were found in Mary's system. So let's say the beer cans were Mark's, and let's also just agree that, although it certainly could have happened, the Great Danes were very unlikely, given their breed and that breed's temperament, that Great Danes were very unlikely to maul Mary to death. Sure, it appears that they had definitely suffered some neglect and possibly even some abuse, but tragically, these were certainly not the first Great Danes to suffer either of those things. Now that we've assumed that the beer cans are Mark's and the Danes didn't kill Mary, again, just assumptions, not facts, and something that we know is actually contrary to the facts as the authorities seem to understand them. Just imagine, if you would, for a moment, this totally hypothetical situation: an estranged husband and a wife share a car. Because of that estrangement, their house has become functionally hers, their home has become functionally hers, and on top of that, whenever he comes over to use their car, which has basically become hers because it's at their house, she acts like he's borrowing her car. So he's lost his house, he's lost his car, and let me just pause right now and point out that if you share ownership of a car with someone, you both have an equal right to drive it or even loan it. So if your shared car is being driven around, it's as likely to be driven by you or someone you loaned it to, or even someone who is driving you somewhere, as it is to be driven by the other person. But if you wanted everyone to assume that they knew who was driving a vehicle and that it wasn't you or a friend of yours, then getting the person you shared with to rent a car in their own name and be seen driving it around seems like a pretty good way to do that. And since rental contracts limit who can legally drive a car, anyone who's casually interested is much less likely to consider that someone other than the person who rented the car might be driving it. What if Mary Matthews had been dead for days before her body was found? That would explain why Officer Blaha found the body bloated despite the low temperatures, which ranged from the low 30s to the mid-50s in the days surrounding her death. What if the beer cans were Mark's instead of Mary's, suggesting that he had spent hours or even days in Mary's house recently? What if Mary hadn't been intoxicated? In fact, she wasn't, or at least not very, according to the toxicology report. What if someone other than Mary drove Mark to jail? What if Mary was already dead at that point? What if Mary's dogs going crazy at 3 a.m. on the night of November 1st wasn't because they were mauling Mary, but because the third dog who had was being removed from the premises? Or perhaps the third dog was brought to the premises for the express purpose of biting chunks out of Mary's body to make it appear she died of mauling. We know there was blood everywhere, so we know Mary bled. But did she bleed because of dog bites, or were dog bites used to obscure her bleeding? Why did Luke Matthews not mention all the blood? Why did he seem to think his stepmother would respond to CPR? Was he just in shock? Possibly. Why, since there was no alcohol in her system and only therapeutic levels of her legal prescription drugs, did Mary Matthews change her clothes but not call for help? What if she was never in a position to make the decision about calling for help or not? What if her clothes were changed because the first set revealed a telltale piece of evidence, or failed to show something that should have been there? The only evidence we have that Mary Matthews was still alive when Mark was delivered to jail is Mark's statement and the neighbor's belief that it was Mary driving the rental car that took Mark to jail, and that it was Mary who returned, parked the car, and disappeared into the house, never to be seen alive again. Well, that and the text message that Mary's employer received on the 30th, but even if Mary's phone was locked with facial recognition, her face would have been there to open the phone if she'd been murdered. Someone else could have sent the text. Of course, I don't know what really happened, and it could be that only Mary Matthews knows what really happened. But there are too many strange things associated with this case for me not to think something more than a tragic mauling occurred. I'm going to try to organize everything we just talked about by running down a top 10 list, if you will, a numbered list of things that just don't seem to sit right. Number 1, Mary's car burning. Number 2, the existence of a third food bowl but no third dog, especially since if the Danes were as vicious as Mark claimed, the third food bowl would only be a source of conflict, of dogfighting between the two. Number 3, Mark's insistence on the viciousness of the Danes. Demonstrably not a vicious breed. Were the Danes truly vicious, or was Mark eager to make sure no one would think that a different dog, the hypothetical third dog, could have been the vicious one. Number 4, Mark claiming that the beer cans belonged to Mary due to her chronic beer drinking, even though the talk screen found no alcohol in her system, and social media, as well as family, have asserted that Mark was the beer drinker, not Mary. Number 5, the fact that Luke Matthews didn't react to or mention the blood and seemed to think Mary might respond to CPR. Number 6, Officer Blaha noting that the victim's body looked bloated and very much dead, even though according to the official version of events, Mary had been dead barely 12 hours and temperatures had ranged from cool to cold. In fact, as I've alluded to before, temperatures from October 30th to November 1st in the Waynesville area ranged from the low 30s to the mid-50s. Number 7, the fact that Mary's failure to call for help was explained away by inebriation, but a talk screen found no alcohol in her system and a low level of prescription pills. Additionally, family has acknowledged that Mary was an abuser of prescription pills, and calling an ambulance would have been an opportunity to get more pills, and yet she did not. Number 8, the fact that she had been mauled so badly that there was blood everywhere, yet she managed to change her clothes. And number 9, even more importantly, managed to get 2 human-sized dogs who were furious enough, even against type, even against breed, furious and feral enough to maul her to death, but not so furious and feral as to stop her from forcing them out of the house. Number 10, just the fact that an estranged wife gave her husband a lift to jail to turn himself in for failure to pay child support? Sure, that's possible, I suppose, but it sounds absurd when you say it out loud. So, officially, Mary Melissa Matthews died of a tragic dog mauling by a breed that generally doesn't maul. After being mauled, she was still well enough to eject the furious giant dogs from the house and to change her clothes, but she didn't call for help before dying, which was explained by the subsequently erroneous belief that she was too intoxicated to realize how injured she was or to call for help, but then the talk screen comes back essentially clean, so we know she wasn't too intoxicated to call for help. Could she have erroneously misjudged the gravity of her condition? Sure. Look, I know I'm starting to repeat myself here, but in order for the official version of events to have occurred the way they officially supposedly did, all of the unlikelihoods that I've just enumerated have to be true. All of them together. I ask you, is it possible that by twisting the Rubik's Cube just a bit, all of these unlikelihoods resolve into a clearer picture and a chain of events that feels a lot less unlikely? That's ultimately for you and hopefully law enforcement to investigate further and decide. I know from what I've read that Mary's family, who it's important to note I have not been in contact with, has urged the authorities to investigate further, but that the authorities seem satisfied with their result. Personally, I'm not an expert. As you know, I'm not a law enforcement officer. I'm not a private detective. I'm just a true crime podcaster reading articles on the internet, but the official version of events in Mary Melissa Matthews' mysterious mauling death doesn't pass what I call the torturous logic test. What do I mean by the torturous logic test? Well, how many logically tortured, extremely unlikely assumptions do you have to accept in order for something else to be true? That's the torturous logic test. So, if Mary was just mauled like they say, you'd have to accept everything I just laid out as being true. My instincts tell me there's a version of this story that requires you only to accept a couple of unlikely things, and even those things are far less unlikely than the authorities have apparently already been willing to accept. I know Mary's family wants further investigation, and I hope the Clear Creek, Ohio Police Department decides to reopen the case. If you have any information about the death of Mary Melissa Matthews, you should contact the Clear Creek, Ohio Police Department at 937-748-1267. That's their non-emergency business hours number. Or you can email them crimetips, CRIMETIPS, crimetips at clearcreektownship.com. I'll put full contact info in the show notes. I'm Zevin Odelberg. This has been Kinda Murdery. You've been listening to Part 2 of Scooby-Doo, Why Did You? The Mysterious Mauling of Mary Melissa Matthews. Enjoy the Super Bowl, everybody, and I'll see you on Thursday.